Poe's ingenious detective is a name that Poe found in a book. Dupin was a minor French statesman known as a walking library, a living encyclopedia who read and remembered everything, from the Bible to Homer to the Quran to Rousseau. Poe himself thought very highly of his own analytic abilities, challenging anyone in one publication to send him a cryptographic puzzle he could not solve. Poe's nameless narrator, the foil Doyle, followed when he invented Watson, who watches Holmes' great genius at work, says many think calculation and discrimination, gathering conclusions and dividing possibilities, are at odds with the imagination, but they are wrong. Dupin later explains, after showing his genius, that imagination is both poetry and science. In other words, both Coleridge and Hegel, emotion and reason. And this is why he can read others and solve cases others can't. The imagination is not at odds with reason, but rather verbal and emotional reasoning support each other in the imagination. Dupin deduces what the cops and others can't because they don't look, listen, or feel as much as he does for criminals and the victims. Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, modeled in part on Dupin, is fantastic at seeing clues and making analytical deductions. But unlike Dupin, Holmes infamously can't read emotions in others, which is not ideal for determining motives. Doyle sacrifices emotion for pure reason with Holmes, much like Kant in his first critique. Dupin shows off to the narrator how good he is at reading others, while Holmes can make little sense of them, but both detectives are dysfunctional and antisocial, incapable of interacting with most as most do. Holmes because he can't read others, and Dupin because he can't help it. Hegel, like Kant, argues reason is superior to emotion, and was no romantic like Rousseau or Poe. The narrator says, great minds are as solid as any method, but they also use intuition. A great mind is more than a mere calculator. Math can make us think, he says, but thought is more than calculation. Because without motive, without the fuel, the car doesn't run. The fuel is an element of the car. It's not superfluous or something you can ignore. It is part of the situation, and it is an element of logic. Math can make us think, but doing equations does not show us thought like games. Games like chess, checkers, cards, and detective stories don't just teach us to calculate the moves of pieces, but understand motives. Not moves in straight lines, but arcs and curves found in fiction. The feelings that move the players, that move the pieces, the greater game. Chess and cards don't merely teach us to understand the game, but to understand people such as ourselves in games and situations of life. We love tales with hidden twists because they show us ourselves beneath the words and characters, beneath the pieces of the game Poe is staging for us. The narrator tells us chess is not the best game for brilliance. A game of checkers is better. We think that chess, a complicated game with complex rules, pieces, observation, and detail beyond most people's abilities, is the better game for revealing ingenious critical thinking. But the narrator says, complexity can be mistaken in chess for profound genius, but the average person cannot use a chess move in daily life, which means being simple and stupid and childlike and silly and fictional has great value for logic and reasoning beyond what idealists and philosophers who are idealists like Kant and Hegel can understand. He says concentration and complexity can be mistaken for profound genius. Somebody trains as a chess master for 40 years and they are a brilliant chess master, but a brilliant move in checkers that anyone could make but doesn't, and only one or two do rarely. This can show us something profound, something simple that isn't just useful or meaningful in the game but in much of life. And I would say, along with Wittgenstein here, and just import, because it would feel profoundly like it fits. What feels deep is not a complex Russian chess move, but a simple thing where you learn something profound. The more one feels without thinking it out, and then can go on emotionally into other thinking. And that is why emotion is a key component in the architecture of thought and logic, such that it cannot be boiled down to mathematical rules. Who and what we trust is formative to reason. Poe tells us through his narrator that profound great minds don't focus on the complexity of the object, but the simplicity of the subject. Not on the intelligence of objectivity, but the stupidity of subjectivity. A great player throws themselves into their opponent's position, feels for them, the narrator says, and often sees in a glance, a clue that brings a flash of brilliant intuition. The brilliant player sees the moves they can use to tempt or scare their opponent into losing, which are often quite simple and stupid like all of us. The simple and the stupid is what works on everybody and oneself. Being proud and overcomplicating things screws everything up. Great chess players have attention, memory, and knowledge of the game, but the skill of the brilliant analyst is beyond the limits of rules in a silent host of observations and inferences. In philosophical investigations, if I fear putting my hand in a flame, 1,000 voices interwoven cry out. It is not the validity of inference, but the quality of observation, of knowing what to observe, is what the narrator says. So it is not thinking complicated, it's not overthinking, it's knowing what simples or complexes to look at and think through. The analyst does not confine their attention to the visible pieces on the board, but rather to their partners and opponents, how they arrange and observe their cards with their fingers and eyes, reading the other players. Subjects moved, moving objects, the whole situation and circuit. This is the narrator's intro to the story. The narrator tells us the greater analysts can play as if their opponents have their cards turned outward towards them, and then Dupin demonstrates, because if you want to be a true genius, you have to look at objectivity and subjectivity. So if you can read what's important to people like sex and violence and others, you can solve murder mysteries much more brilliantly than the police. They have scientific procedure, but they do not have psychic power of poetry and emoting for others. How perceptive.